The Tonight Show interview was supposed to highlight James Rodriguez's work with burn victims and his foundation that provides support for fire survivors. He'd come to discuss his 30 years of advocacy and the healing programs he'd created for trauma victims. But when Jimmy asked what drove his passion for helping fire victims, something devastating broke open in his weathered expression. James sat in the blue chair, his hands showing the faint scars that most people assumed were from his advocacy work. He'd spent 3 decades building a reputation as someone who understood the pain of fire survivors better than anyone. Tonight, he was about to reveal the horrific truth that had driven every sleepless night of his charitable work. "You know, Jimmy," he began, his voice heavy with 30 years of carried guilt. "Everyone thinks I help fire victims because I understand trauma and loss. But the real reason is that I need to atone for the 8 innocent people I killed in a fire I started." Jimmy leaned forward, immediately sensing this wasn't going to be another inspiring survivor story. His experience had taught him to recognize when someone was carrying the weight of unimaginable guilt. "You started a fire that killed people?" he asked carefully. James took a shaky breath, his entire body tensing with the weight of 3 decades of secrecy. "The Riverside Apartment fire in 1993, he said quietly. 8 people died, including 2 children. Everyone thinks it was an electrical accident, but I set that fire deliberately." The studio audience fell into complete silence, the kind of quiet that happens when people hear something so shocking it stops time. The camera stayed focused on James's face as tears began forming in his eyes. "I was 22 years old, angry and seeking revenge against my ex-girlfriend who lived in that building. This was in downtown Phoenix," James continued, his voice growing steadier as he forced himself to speak the truth. "Maria had broken up with me 6 months earlier, and I couldn't accept it. I'd been drinking heavily, stalking her, making her life miserable." Jimmy's expression showed deep concern, mixed with horror. "What happened the night of the fire?" he asked gently. "I'd been drinking all day, consumed with rage that she was dating someone new," James replied, his voice filled with self-loathing. "I went to her building around 2 a.m. with a can of gasoline, planning to scare her by setting a small fire in the lobby." He paused, wiping his eyes with trembling hands. "I thought I'd light a small fire, trigger the smoke alarms, force everyone to evacuate, and ruin her night. I never intended for anyone to get hurt. But I was drunk and stupid," James continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The fire spread faster than I ever imagined. The old building went up like kindling, and people were trapped on the upper floors." The camera caught the anguish in his expression as he relived the worst night of his life. "I stood across the street and watched 8 people die because of my need for petty revenge. 2 of them were children, a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old. Jimmy moved from behind his desk to sit closer to him, understanding the magnitude of his confession. "Was Maria one of the victims?" he asked gently. "No," James said, his voice cracking with irony. "She wasn't even home that night. She was at her new boyfriend's place. The people who died were complete strangers. Families with children, elderly residents, people who had nothing to do with my anger. Mrs. Chen, 67 years old, couldn't make it down the stairs," he continued through tears. "The Martinez family, parents and 2 little kids, were trapped on the 3rd floor. Mr. Williams jumped from the 4th floor, trying to escape." The studio was completely silent, except for the soft sounds of people in the audience getting emotional. "How did you escape being caught?" "Jimmy, luck and cowardice," James replied bitterly. "No one saw me, there were no cameras back then. The investigators ruled it electrical because the building was old and had faulty wiring. I never came forward. I went to all 8 funerals," he continued, fresh tears streaming down his face. "I sat in the back, watching families destroy themselves with grief, knowing I was responsible for their pain." Jimmy reached over and squeezed his hand. "How did you live with that knowledge?" he asked. "I didn't live. I existed," James admitted honestly. "I became an alcoholic for 10 years, tried to drink away the guilt. Every night, I saw those faces, heard the screams, smelled the smoke. I attempted suicide 3 times in the first 5 years," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each confession. "But I was too much of a coward to die, just like I was too much of a coward to confess." "What changed?" Jimmy asked softly. "I volunteered at a burn unit in 2003, James said firmly. "I met a little girl who'd survived a house fire, and she reminded me of the Martinez children I'd killed. I realized I could either waste my life in guilt or spend it trying to save other fire victims. I got sober, started my foundation, dedicated everything to helping burn survivors," he continued. But every person I help, I think about the 8 people I can never save." Jimmy turned to address the camera. James's story shows how a moment of anger and poor judgment can have devastating consequences that last a lifetime. "The thing is," James added, finding his voice as someone who'd lived with unbearable guilt, "I thought my revenge would hurt one person. But 8 innocent people paid the price for my inability to accept rejection." She looked directly into the camera. "If you're watching this and you're angry at someone, consumed with thoughts of revenge, please remember that violence always hurts more than your intended target. The children who died had nothing to do with my breakup. And to the families of fire victims," he continued with fierce determination, "please know that not all fires are accidents. Some are caused by people like me, people too selfish and immature to handle their pain without destroying others." Jimmy wiped his own eyes, clearly moved by his honesty. "Do you plan to turn yourself in to authorities?" he asked. "I already have," James replied honestly. "I contacted the Phoenix Police Department before coming here tonight. Whatever happens next, I can't live with this secret anymore." "The Martinez family deserves to know why their children died," he continued. "Mrs. Chen's daughter deserves to know her mother didn't die in an accident. They all deserve the truth, even if it destroys my life." Jimmy stood up and helped James to his feet. "James Rodriguez, everyone," he announced. "Someone brave enough to confess murder to give families the truth they deserve." The audience rose in subdued applause, understanding they'd witnessed something profound rather than entertaining. This was recognition of accountability, justice delayed, and the courage to face consequences 30 years later. As the show ended, Jimmy kept his arm around James's shoulders. "Thank you for telling the truth," he whispered. "Those families finally have answers, and you finally have the chance for real redemption." 6 months later, James was arrested and charged with 8 counts of murder and arson. His confession led to the case being reopened and families finally receiving closure about their loved ones' deaths. The interview segment sparked national conversations about delayed justice, the statute of limitations on murder, and how guilt can drive both destruction and redemption. Victim advocacy groups praised his courage to come forward. James received mixed reactions: condemnation from victims' families, who felt betrayed by his years of deception, and support from others who recognized his genuine remorse and 30 years of service to fire victims. His foundation continued operating under new leadership, with victims' families taking control to ensure his tainted legacy didn't diminish the help provided to burn survivors. Jimmy featured victim advocacy experts and criminal justice specialists on his show after that interview, using James's story to discuss how crimes affect communities for generations. Today, James serves a life sentence but continues his burn victim advocacy from prison, working with counselors to help other criminals face accountability for their actions. The man who killed 8 people seeking petty revenge became the catalyst for legislative changes requiring DNA evidence preservation and extending statutes of limitations for serious crimes. His 30 years of hiding behind charity work ended, but his confession finally gave 8 families the truth they'd waited decades to hear. Sometimes justice is delayed, but accountability has no expiration date. The Riverside Apartment building was demolished years ago, but a memorial now stands there listing the 8 victims' names. James's confession ensured they're remembered not as accident victims, but as the innocent people whose murders finally came to light.